And as a psychoanalytic therapist, the way I think about that is, okay, so what's causing that? What's underneath it? So my focus is kind of two things as I'm trying to work with somebody. One, understand what's driving this. Why are they depressed or anxious or fighting with somebody? What's causing it on their end? And there may be some things from the other person that's involved too.
Okay.
So I want to understand, but also then I want to help them build the skills kind of needed to make whatever isn't working work.
Well, welcome everybody today to our first episode for Psychology for Everyday. I'm joined today with Dr. Mark MacMillin, licensed psychologist and associate professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And today we're going to talk about modern psychodynamic therapy. Could you, Dr. MacMillan, just please go over like your education and credentials and stuff, and just let our audience know how you got to be the amazing expert that you are today?
Well, interestingly enough, I began in the same cohort as Dr. Bridgman at the Rosemead School of Psychology. We were both in the same class, and I suppose you could come out of there almost any orientation you like, although there was a significant psychoanalytic influence with the dean and some other key faculty, and I was immediately drawn to the psychoanalytic, well, I was going to say track. There wasn't a formal track, but that...
Right. Like our options were analytic, dynamic, and family systems.
Yeah.
That was kind of it then.
And then we had a one prominent faculty member who I think was kind of more gestaltish, wasn't he?
Oh, that's right. We did. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was a very influential faculty member, at least in my mind. I suppose you had to go somewhere else for your CBT, which you did.
I did. Far away.
But that was to get me started, and then I was fortunate enough to get hired right out of grad school to work in a program that was both an inpatient and outpatient clinic that was a psychoanalytic team. So I really kind of cut my teeth in terms of actual practice, working with this team of people that was doing hospital work and outpatient work from a psychoanalytic perspective, which was an amazing launching to my kind of learning how to be, that kind of a therapist.
What facility was that?
It was called the Minnesmeyer Clinic West, and then it later was the Cloud Townsend Clinic.
Right. It sounds like excellent training.
Yeah, it's very good. And John Townsend and Henry Cloud, who are alumni of our school, they were very influential in me kind of learning how to understand and use this kind of work at the time.
So like in our day, in our doctoral program, we learned a lot about theory. We didn't learn a lot about application and actually what to do with patients so much, right? And so with Minnesmeyer training that you had, that's where you were able to cut your teeth and what do you do?
Right, and excuse me, there was a very influential faculty member named Dr. Randy Sorensen, who was there at the time, and I was fortunate enough to have 2 years of supervision with him at our on-campus clinic called the Biola Counseling Center, and he was my supervisor, and he was psychoanalytic, and he was, just a really neat person. I had the utmost respect and was very fond of him. I think the feeling was mutual, and I learned so much from him, and that really prepared me to go off to the Minnesmeyer Clinic West and to, kind of go beyond what I'd already learned and how to do it with people that are in crisis, people that were in the hospital.
Right. That's its own thing, doing crisis work and hospital work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you did go to some advanced training after that, right?
Yeah, and then in the early 2000s, I spent a year at the Newport Psychoanalytic Institute. Okay. Most major cities have a psychoanalytic institute, or 2 or 3 or 5.
Right.
LA has about 5, I think. And I think most major large cities do throughout the world, by the way, not just in the United States. And so I spent a year there getting additional training. Okay.
All right. And then when did you start teaching?
Well, I first taught my first class for Dr. John Carter at Trinity.
One of our professors.
Yeah, I think you might have.
I think I was involved in that.
I think you were involved in that. Yeah. I taught a class for him on psychoanalytic therapy. and that kind of got me started. And then this will be my 13th year with the Chicago School.
Wow.
A program that we are both now on faculty
That's right,
with. So
that's right.
yeah, this will be my 13th year.
Okay, excellent. And then you have another life where you write books. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I actually, the reason why I stopped my analytic training after 1 year, my formal psychoanalytic training, was I decided I wanted to be a writer as a hobby, not as a day job, but as a hobby. And I write kind of psychologically themed novels about relationships and people that are struggling to grow up or work things out, or a hard relationship, or to forgive a severe injury or trauma. So I've have 4 complete novels and a couple others that are in the works.
Wow.
And then I've done a couple of speaking engagements in the last year where I speak about the themes in my novels.
Okay. So the books are psychologically informed.
Yeah.
But they're stories, novels that are really engaging, but people can also, if they are thinking about what they're reading, they'll be able to notice the more psychologically informed aspects of the character development and the relationships along the plot.
Attachment theory, character development, revenge or forgiveness, working through conflict, repairing and setting boundaries, and all those themes, and probably others I'm not thinking of right now are woven into my novels. Freedom and slavery and all these, and I mean more mental freedom or slavery, not so much behind bars.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. There are quite a number of authors who research things like psychological profiling for different characters and stuff, because they're writers who want to provide a higher level of accuracy in the character development. So they got to go learn psychology. You've done it the other way around. You studied psychology and then developed your wordsmithing track. So.
Yeah, well, it's more a hobby where I love to read, I love to watch movies, and not so much action movies, but movies that are a story about somebody or somebody's. And that's kind of what got me interested. I thought, well, I want to do this. People are doing it. I want to try this too.
Okay. And so then your books, you have 4 currently available?
3 currently available, and the 4th one is in the final editing process. I expect it'll be out by the end of this year.
Oh, okay. Just in time for Christmas.
Yeah, and 3 that are actually out on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you have an author website or an author page on Amazon?
Well, I have a website that's Dr. Mark MacMillin, and my books are on there too. I don't have a separate website for the books.
Okay,
it's on my Dr. Mark MacMillan
so
website.
I'll put the links down below. If anybody's interested in looking at Dr. Mac's books, we'll be able to find links down below for Amazon or directly to his website. So we'll do that. Okay. Well, let's switch gears and talk about the living out of this in your attempts to help people as a psychologist in practice. So let's first start with just a broad description of the model that you work from in your office when you're working with people. As psychologists, we all have a kind of theoretical lens that we look through to help understand what's going on with people. So tell us a little bit about the psychoanalytic model that you work from.
Like what I actually do in my office, you mean?
Yeah. What's that look like for you as you're working with people?
Yeah, I guess the place where I'd start with is that people come in with all kinds of complaints, or we call them presenting problems, and they're usually something bad that they want to go away. They're depressed, they're anxious, they're having panic, they're drinking or eating too much, they're fighting with their partner, something like that. Problem with a career maybe. And as a psychoanalytic therapist, the way I think about that is, okay, so what's causing that? What's underneath it? So my focus is kind of 2 things as I'm trying to work with somebody. One, understand what's driving this. Why are they depressed or anxious or fighting with somebody? What's causing it on their end? And there may be some things from the other person that's involved too.
Okay.
So I want to understand, but also then I want to help them build the skills kind of needed to make whatever isn't working work. So, some therapies are more focused on kind of making a symptom go away or reduce a symptom, which is great. by the way. And the way I think about psychoanalytic therapy, I'm more trying to build the skills that are missing in the hope that the symptom will remit or become less.
Okay, so people have problems in their lives. They have relational problems, or they have anxiety or depression or whatever. And so the psychoanalytic model helps you conceptualize, is the word we use in the field, or understand, think about the mechanisms that are at work that are causing that symptom or problem. And then the therapy is about hopefully helping the person get better, right, to remediate. And part of what you're hoping is that they're able to learn not only enough about themselves that they can understand what's happening and why, but they can also then begin to make changes in their life so that they maintain it after therapy's done. Okay. So tell us, for those that are a little more psychologically informed and they've done their research on a little bit of the background with the psychoanalytic model, what are the different kind of components to the model that you think are really important on a kind of day in, day out basis?
Like the different parts of the theory to understand?
Yeah, like we were talking earlier about, before we started recording, right? We were talking about attachment theory, right? Because there's different elements of the psychoanalytic model.
Okay, well, let me start with kind of broad strokes and we can go from there if you like. That, Freud got the party started. He was the genius that started things. He began writing in the 1890s about psychoanalysis, or what later became psychoanalysis. Right. And then, soon thereafter, his daughter, Anna Freud, and several others created what was next called ego psychology, which was kind of the next school of thought on top of Freud's model of classical psychoanalysis, or some people call it id psychology, because he was very focused on the id, which is kind of the primitive or animalistic part of each of us. Ego psychology is more focused on sort of the part of your mind that kind of runs the show and manages emotions and conflicts and things like that. It was more kind of strength-based, focused, kind of helping somebody learn to adapt to their interpersonal environment, or to a relationship challenge, or whatever it may be. And then kind of right on the heels of that and overlapping that was a school of thought called object relations theory, which really got going in the United Kingdom.
The British school.
The British school, it's often called British object relations, as a matter of fact, with very key members like Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott and Ronald Fairbairn.
He was my favorite.
Guntrip and Ballant. There's a lot of very influential peoples that were kind of the leaders of this group. And that, as opposed to ego psychology being more focused on the skills or abilities of the ego, object relations is more focused on relationships. Relationships on the inside, meaning in your mind, memories of relationships, and relationships on the outside, actual physical people that you interact with. And that was more the emphasis of that. And then the third school of thought is self-psychology, started by really one guy, Heinz Kohut. He had collaborators, but he was the main guy. And that was kind of right on the heels of object relations and ego psychology. And so when you and I were in grad school, those were the three main schools.
They were.
This is kind of what I got. What I got in grad school was mostly object relations and ego psychology. Self-psychology wasn't so much an emphasis, although I got that later. And so that was kind of what was happening when we were in grad school back in the 80s, right? Now, more recently, there's been some newer developments that I kind of see it sort of an artificial line in the sand is about starting in around the 80s, early 80s, maybe even late 70s, there began what I call the more contemporary schools, which is things like relational psychoanalysis, intersubjectivity theory, mentalization-based treatment. These are probably the most influential models, I believe, in the 21st century. So there's the way I teach the class at our program, there's kind of 5 schools of thought, and those are they. I combined, by the way, the last ones into one school, even though that's a bit of an artificial.
It works though.
It works for
how they fit together.
It works for the basic class.
Okay. So when you're sitting with somebody and they're dealing with, I'm upset because my boss said whatever, or my significant other did whatever, you're actually thinking through these different kind of lenses or angles on what's happening. You're thinking about those internalized object relations, the patterns, if you will, of relationships that predate the first one that are now maybe kind of having undue influence on the current. You're looking at the mentalization aspects, the kind of that inner dialogue of what they think they're thinking about and what they think the other person is thinking about. And you're looking about that other lens of their ability to, on the one hand, kind of be aware of and monitor and therefore regulate urges and moods, reactions, their level of, let's say, healthy interpersonal skills versus maybe overly defensive skills that aren't really helping much in the current situation. All right. So how much of that do you teach your patients? You start talking about ego psychology or the id or mentalization?
Well, it's a good question. I try not to get too didactic about it with them. That's probably not the best way of saying it. I try not to be too intellectual about it and teach them psychoanalytic theory. But as you and I have discussed, that I do want to eventually teach my clients to kind of be their own therapist, or some people call that a better parent to themselves, or their own therapist, where they take in enough from me and from our time together that I sort of work myself out of a job. That's what I'm trying to do, and
occupational hazard.
It's kind of an occupational hazard. People keep leaving us,
right.
But
no abandonment issues.
No abandonment issues. But it's kind of a bittersweet thing that even though people go away, that it's sort of like, the kids are going off to college and they're ready for it and they're off to a good life, which is kind of the sweet part of them leaving, is when they've got enough of it inside their minds and then maybe enough of, me and our important interactions in their minds, hopefully, it's something they can draw upon later, and where they can catch themselves going, oh yeah, there I go again. I tend to get angry when this happens, or there I go again. I tend to withdraw when somebody does that, and they can catch themselves where they become their own therapist or a good parent to themselves.
Yeah, I remember that phrase from grad school of reparenting yourself, right? I always thought that was a fascinating phrase, because as a grad student, I was like, how do I do that? Right? So when you're working with people every day and they're starting to get the hang of this kind of lens of understanding what's happening for them in their day-to-day life, how they're reacting, what parts of them are getting activated, and how to think about them. Like Hollywood portrays therapy in all kind of horrible ways in my mind. I don't very often see a portrayal of therapy that actually resonates with me as something which is realistic. Everything seems so stereotypically canned in a really negative way. But let's talk about that for a minute. So what's it look like in the office? The classic, kind of Hollywood picture of, well, tell me, how does that make you feel? This very much overemphasis on emotion, recognition and labeling, and how does that work for you?
Yeah, I like you. The only depiction of therapy that I like in the media was probably Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting.
Oh yeah, right.
He was so genuine, and that I felt good about him representing us for the most part. Somebody that's present and genuine and real and cares about the, in this case, Matt Damon, the person he's trying to help. That, I'm trying to, when therapy works, and it doesn't always work, unfortunately.
Right.
There's some people I don't feel like I've helped. I come to care about them, and I come to, think about them, and they are in my mind, and I'm, trying to build into their lives as best I can, and with things that hopefully they can make use of down the road and currently. And so, I'm trying to, it's not just about the information, or I'm trying to build a certain kind of a relationship where that might be a model for what they might look for in other places. If all goes well, somebody that hopefully is experienced as empathic and present and engaging and responsive, and, when somebody's upset and cares about how they're doing. And so I'm hoping to provide them with an experience of something that hopefully is better than some of what they've had before.
Okay. So part of the theory about what helps people in therapy is having what we call it in the field, it's a corrective experience, because of the therapy relationship is really focused on the benefit of the patient. And it's like the one place on the planet where that's true for, well, it should be true for therapists in general, right? Is where they're there to kind of look after the best interests of their patients, right?
Yeah.
And so within that context, hopefully, you do build not only just like a relationship which is really helpful for the person because they get to have you fully present with them to understand them and to be fully kind of deeply aware of what they're experiencing, thinking, and feeling. But it's also, there's a level of genuineness to it, that there's authenticity, that you're not just there because of the money or whatever, that like you and I both know you can't pay us enough to make that work.
Yeah.
It's interpersonal and it's going to work or it's not, right? None of us are a perfect fit for everybody.
Right. Yeah, sure.
Which is why it leaves a lot of room for competition.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of people to go around.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So the therapy itself is both kind of past focused and present focused, and just all depends upon the content and what's happening on a given day as to kind of where that emphasis lies. And then you talk about real world problems. It's not all focused on tell me about your mother. I'm sure there are those conversations.
Cliche,
Right. But modern, and there's a difference in the field between modern psychoanalytic therapy and traditional. Is that the correct term?
Yeah, traditional or classical
psychoanalysis.
psychoanalysis. It might be called. Some people call it it's psychology. Probably classical psychoanalysis is the most common term. As a matter of fact, there's some people that write in our field about psychoanalytic being unethical and not evidence-based and harmful and all that, and my response to that is, well, if you're talking about the original version of it, it's probably true.
That's probably true, right? But modern is different because modern actually does have evidence-based literature that informs it.
Yeah, that really is a change in the last, I think, the 21st century, because us psychoanalytic folks were a bit arrogant about evidence-based research, and we weren't really doing it early on, kind of snubbed our noses at it, and just said, oh, hey, our clients, our patients get better, that's all we need to know. It was kind of arrogant, and so people accurately, for a time, said there is no evidence, because there really wasn't.
There wasn't.
But in the last 25 years or so, a lot of us have gone, okay, look, anecdotal data is nice, but it's not enough. We need to come to the party and join the scientific community. Right. And in the last 25 years, there is a substantial body of evidence that shows that, the research shows that all the major models are helpful. That debate's kind of over.
Yeah, the kind of classic dodo bird theory.
Yeah, the dodo bird outcome, right.
Yeah. That all therapies are more effective than no therapy. Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay, so then a couple more questions for you. So if someone were to come to somebody like yourself for therapy and they're having just kind of your typical average kind of problems, what kind of things are those that you see in your office?
Yeah, I think most common presentations for probably all of us, at least in private practice, is depression and anxiety, and a lot of times both. I also get people that'll come in and say they're in a quandary about somebody they're dating or somebody they're married to or partnered with, that they're not sure if they can make it work or if they really need to cut bait and move on to somebody else, and they're looking for help to figure out, can I make this work, or is it really just not a good match? And so, and that really lines up well with the way I think and work and like to work. And so I get a lot of that kind of thing. Somebody wondering if they can stay in a marriage, and if so, in a satisfying way. Yeah. So I'm very happy to, I kind of, rub my hands together when I hear something like that.
Right.
Because the way I think is really about, the modern, I tell our students, the modern practice of psychoanalytic therapy is about relationships and the skills needed to make them work. I mean, it's a bit
right.
over of an oversimplification, but that's the focus. It's no longer about, drives and urges like Freud wrote about 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and generally people are way more informed about psychological principles and ideas than they were 100 years ago anyway. So it's much harder to pull off like a Freudian mystique today than it was then. Because, you could be Freud and you could just make stuff up at night, write it down and declare it to be true.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the thing that is, I think, often misunderstood about Freud is that he really is, at least in part, a product of his times. He's writing during Victorian era, Europe, where the sexual repression and, all of that. And he's writing in the shadow of Darwin, Charles Darwin, evolution theory. So he's trying to create a model that kind of lines up with evolution theory, that we're biological beasts trying to propagate our genes and survive into the next generation. Mm-hmm. So what he's writing about really does line up with that, and it fits in with kind of the Victorian era sexual repression. It doesn't line up for people so much today in 2023, right? And which is why there's been a lot written since Freud, but he really was the genius that got started. But there's so much more that's been written. I love it when students come to my basic psychoanalytic class thinking the whole semester's going to be Freud. Like there's been nothing since Freud died in 1939.
Right. I know, right? Like I read before that one of the differences for the times that Freud was, doing his prolific writings, which he wrote volumes and volumes of theory and application, which is kind of a sign of his brilliance as it stands on its own.
Sure.
So, the hard sciences go hand in hand. So he was a physician and a physician trained.
He's a neurologist.
Right, neurologist, specifically. And the lead physicist that was held sway over sciences at the time was Sir Isaac. Mm. So they were under Newtonian physics, right? And so Newtonian physics had some very new fascinating ideas, like the ideas of electricity and electrons were kind of coming into the fore, and one of those created this idea about the importance of energy, right? And so in medicine, it translated into this concept of energies that existed in the body. And Freud applied that idea from physics that segued into medicine into the psychoanalytic concept, right, of what eventually became ego and superego.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was based on an idea that in medicine was based on this concept of humors. Those were the energies in the body. And like classic example has always been in medicine that if you had too much of a certain kind of humor in your body, you'd get a temperature. Yeah. And so then the way to fix that problem was to let it out by bleeding
somebody,
feet, right?
Drilling a hole in their
your temperature drops. Right.
Yeah.
So, Freud was very much a product of his time, right? So he only knew what he and everybody else knew. And he certainly built a phenomenal framework within the limitations of what he knew at the time.
Yeah, and there are some things that are still, some of that is kind of old news for us in 2023, but some of the things are very enduring that he started. Like, he certainly didn't invent the unconscious, but he's probably the guy that paid a lot of attention to it.
He did.
We do things that we don't know why we do them all the time.
Right.
And that's still a very important part of psychoanalytic therapy is let's understand some of your reactions to people and to yourself, and that you don't really understand. You don't know why you do that. You can't give an explanation to your wife or your husband or whoever. Well, let's try to understand. So that's still an important part of modern psychoanalytic therapy is let's understand some things that we don't yet.
Yeah, the thing that we like, that you and I both like about modern psychological models is with the evidence-based models that we get to see what science tells us is true. And then we shift with what the data tells us. And sometimes the models hold, and sometimes they need to be tweaked just a little bit. But generally speaking, we've got them probably more dialed in now than they've ever been.
Yeah.
in history. And so it's a really exciting time to be a clinician, to be able to work with these advanced technologies that are so much more efficient and effective at helping people. And so that brings me to my last question for you. So what do you think is like the average length of time that somebody might spend in therapy and the kind of therapy that you do for a typical kind of problem?
Yeah, it's really variable. I have people come as short as 6 or 9 months, which probably, I know would be long for somebody like you.
Yeah.
6 or 9 months would be short. Someone that really wants just to understand kind of better why something's not working or why something is the way it is, and then to begin to get down the railroad tracks to getting it better, and then they kind of feel like they're good to go. And these are probably more often people that are pretty well put together, fairly solid people, that's really kind of all they need. But I think the typical person I end up seeing for 2, 3, 4 years, because of the kind of style of psychoanalytic therapy, it tends to be longer term. There are short-term models, like we've discussed, but it tends to be, 2 to 4 years. Although I've got people I've been seeing much longer than that, although they typically kind of start and stop and come and go. But it takes kind of a couple years to really kind of sink our teeth into the kind of work that I do.
Yeah, and that makes sense with like what we talked about earlier, right? That one of the primary curative kind of elements is the nature of the relationship itself. And, if you've lived your whole life under a certain pattern of relationships, and then you come into somebody or have somebody comes into your life who's so very different, it can be really, really hard to incorporate and trust all that and to let it really have its ripple effect and kind of blossom within your life in a short period of time. So having enough time, an adequate amount of time for any individual, that makes sense. That would be a little bit longer.
Well, and let me say a little bit more about that really what I'm trying to accomplish is not only create a certain kind of a relationship with you, my client, that I hope is empathic and emotionally in tuned and responsive, but I'm also trying to help my clients create a certain kind of relationship with themselves. Of being curious and empathic and forgiving and
self-compassionate,
self-aware, and understanding themselves. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite guys, Stephen Mitchell, a more modern guy who sadly is deceased, he writes about how the outcome of a good therapy sometimes is you come in only knowing about 2 or 3 different versions of yourself, and you leave knowing about a dozen or 2 versions of yourself, because you realize there's a lot more to you than you do. But not only are you aware of more versions of yourself, but you become more skilled at moving in between being a little down or a little up, a little hopeful, a little cynical, a teacher and a husband, or a wife and a student, or an employer, or we're all in multiple, or most of us are in multiple roles and have different states. We're all a little down one day, a little up another day, and a little anxious one day. And, that's just sort of the nature, as I see it, of being human.
You mean therapists have good and bad days?
Well, I've heard that others do.
other therapists do. Well, Dr. McMillan, I want to thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure having you on the channel. Of course, as Dr. McMillan intimated earlier, this won't be the last time I probably see him this week. I'll see him tomorrow. So, but I did want to thank you for stopping by. I want to say to our audience that if you guys have questions you'd like for Dr. Mac to address, or if you'd like for us to address again, please feel free to drop them in the comments below, and maybe it'll be episode 2 at some point in the future.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.